I have never laughed during a military briefing. 42 species conquered, 11 galactic sectors brought under the banner of the Dominion, 19 years of frontline service, and I had never once found anything funny about the process of learning how to break a civilization. But sitting in that briefing room aboard the Pale Verdict, surrounded by 200 soldiers of the 9th Expeditionary Corps, watching a cultural intelligence analyst named Dorov project human fairy tales onto the tactical display, I laughed so hard that my ribs ached. "This," Dorov said, tapping his control pad, "is what the humans call a dragon." The image filled the screen, a massive reptile with wings spanning the width of a cruiser, breathing columns of fire from its jaws, circling above a stone fortress, while tiny human warriors hurled spears at its belly. The rendering was crude, pulled from some intercepted human data archive, but the detail was enough to understand the concept. A flying, fire-breathing predator the size of a warship, and the humans believed these things once roamed their skies. The room erupted. Corporal Rin, my scanner tech, slapped her knee so hard she nearly cracked the plating on her leg armor. Private Sen, the youngest soldier in my squad, was doubled over in his seat, gasping between fits of laughter. I sat in the third row, tears leaking from the corners of my eyes, watching Dorov cycle through image after image with the patience of a man who had expected this reaction and already grown tired of it. "These are their undead," he said. The screen showed rotting humanoid figures rising from burial pits, arms outstretched, eyes empty. Humans believe that their dead can be reanimated through ritual or infection and turned into mindless, flesh-consuming soldiers. More laughter. Someone in the back row howled. "This is what they call a god." The image shifted to a towering figure standing on a cloud, robed in light, holding a bolt of lightning in one hand and the planet in the other. The figure had a beard. Its expression suggested mild disappointment, like a father who had caught his children stealing from the kitchen. Humans have constructed thousands of these across their cultural history, beings of infinite power who created the universe, flooded entire continents, parted oceans, and raised the dead. Every human civilization, without exception, has produced its own version. I wiped my eyes and leaned toward Kovan. If they spent half this creative energy on weapons development, we might actually have a fight on our hands. Kovan grinned. "Give me one of those dragons. I would ride it into the command deck of the carrier and demand a promotion." Dorov continued. "Shapeshifters, trickster spirits that could bend reality. Warriors cursed to fight forever without dying, an underworld ruled by a king of death, a serpent so large it wrapped around the entire planet and held its own tail in its mouth." Each image drew fresh waves of amusement from the assembled soldiers. We were 2 days from orbital insertion over Earth, Sol 3, the homeworld of humanity. We were the 4th Expeditionary Force assigned to the subjugation of this species, and the cultural briefing was mandatory for all forward units. Standard procedure: know the enemy's psychology, anticipate their breaking points, exploit their fears. I had done this 42 times. Every species had something. The Dren feared silence. The Vothal feared open water. The Kimari feared their own reflection. Understanding these things made conquest faster, cleaner. So I sat. And I listened. And I laughed. Because humans were supposed to be a Tier 2 civilization, with fragmented governments, no interstellar capability, and an atmosphere-locked military force that had never fought anything beyond its own kind. They were supposed to be easy. But Dorov did not laugh. I noticed it halfway through the briefing. Every soldier in the room was wiping tears, clutching their stomachs, nudging each other with elbows. Dorov stood at the podium, cycling through the images, narrating the content in his flat, clinical voice, and his face held nothing. No amusement, no contempt, not even boredom. His expression was the careful blankness of a man who was choosing each word with surgical precision, because the wrong word would reveal something he was not authorized to share. I stopped laughing. When the briefing ended and the room began to empty, I approached the podium. Dorov was packing his data pads, moving quickly, avoiding eye contact with the soldiers filing past him. I blocked his path and asked him directly why he had not laughed. It was not an accusation. I was genuinely curious. He had just spent 90 minutes presenting the most absurd collection of primitive fantasies I had ever encountered, and he had treated every single one of them like a classified weapons schematic. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Earth carries a designation I have never seen applied to any other world in the Dominion's database." I asked what designation. "Mythology status. Unverified. Do not dismiss." I stared at him. The words did not make sense. Every conquered world had its mythology assessed during pre-invasion analysis, and every single one had been stamped with the same conclusion. Primitive cultural framework, no tactical relevance, file and disregard. That was the process. That was how it had always worked. Do not dismiss was not a category I had ever heard of. Where did that designation come from? I asked. The Founders. The Founders, the oldest governing body in the Dominion. 12 individuals, so ancient that most soldiers believed they were more legend than reality. Beings who had overseen the expansion of Dominion territory for longer than most species had existed. If the Founders had flagged Earth's mythology, it was not a clerical notation, it was a warning. What does it mean? I pressed. Dorov sealed his last data pad into his case and looked at me with an expression I would not understand until much later. It was pity. My clearance does not cover the reasoning, Sergeant Ton. I was told to deliver the briefing. I have delivered it. That is the extent of my involvement. He left. I stood at the podium alone, turning the phrase over in my mind. Do not dismiss. It was a strange thing to attach to a collection of fire-breathing lizards and angry sky beings. I filed it away in the part of my brain that stored minor oddities, the kind of thing I might revisit over a drink after the campaign was finished, and I walked back to my squad's deployment bay to prepare for drop pod insertion. But there was something else, something I had noticed weeks earlier during my pre-deployment review of the mission files, and had chosen not to mention to my squad because it served no tactical purpose, and would only invite questions I could not answer. This was the Dominion's 4th expedition to Earth. The record said so clearly. First expedition, launched 512 years ago. Second expedition, 312 years ago. Third expedition, 144 years ago. And now us. The records for all 3 previous expeditions were sealed at the highest classification level I had ever encountered. Not restricted, not compartmented, sealed, with a clearance requirement so far above my rank that the system would not even display the name of the classification tier. I had requested a summary, denied. I had requested casualty figures, denied. I had requested the names of commanding officers so I could cross-reference their post-mission debriefs, denied, with an additional notation that no post-mission debriefs existed because no debrief had ever been filed. 3 expeditions, no debriefs. No accessible records, no veterans I could locate in any personnel database in the entire Dominion military network. 3 entire expeditionary forces had gone to Earth, and it was as if they had dropped into a hole in the universe, and the hole had closed behind them. I told myself it meant nothing. Failed expeditions happened. Records got sealed to protect institutional reputation. Veterans retired, relocated, died of old age. There were a dozen rational explanations, and I chose the most comfortable one and wrapped it around myself like armor. Because in 2 days, I was going to Earth. My squad was going to Earth, and we were the best soldiers in the 9th Corps, and the 9th Corps was the best unit in the Dominion military, and whatever had happened to those 3 expeditions would not happen to us. The night before insertion, my squad gathered in the deployment bay for our pre-drop ritual. We checked weapons. We calibrated armor. We synchronized comms. And because we were soldiers, and because soldiers have always found courage in mockery, we joked about Earth. Kovan said he was going to capture a dragon and train it to fetch his equipment. Rin said she wanted to find one of those angry sky gods and challenge it to a game of tactical chess. Sen, who was 20 years old and on his first campaign, and trying very hard to hide the tremor in his hands, said he hoped the undead were real, because at least they would be slow enough for him to hit. We laughed. We all laughed. The sound filled the deployment bay, bright and confident, and full of the easy arrogance of soldiers who had never been beaten. In 12 hours, we would be on the surface of Earth. I wish I could go back to that bay. I wish I could stand in front of my squad one more time and tell them what I know now. I wish I could tell them that Dorov was the only honest person on that ship, that the designation was not a bureaucratic curiosity, that the reason 3 expeditions had vanished was not incompetence, or bad luck, or administrative suppression. But I cannot go back. None of us can. The fleet entered the Sol system at 0400 hours, standard Dominion time, and within 9 minutes of crossing the outer boundary, every long-range sensor drone we had deployed in advance went dark. All of them, simultaneously. Not destroyed, not jammed, simply gone, as if they had decided, all at once, to stop existing. Colonel Drass, commanding from the bridge of the Pale Verdict, called it a malfunction. He ordered secondary drones launched. He adjusted the approach vector. He maintained formation. I stood in my drop pod, sealed inside my armor, gripping the restraint harness with both hands, and I felt something I had not felt in 19 years of combat. I felt the floor of my certainty crack. And far below us, through the thin atmosphere of a small blue world that should have been easy, something ancient opened its eyes. The drop was textbook. Pod separation was clean. Atmospheric entry was smooth. The heat shields held without fluctuation, and my squad of 14 hit the canopy of a dense mountain forest in Central Europe at precisely the coordinates Command had designated for Drop Zone 3. I felt the jolt of impact travel through my spine, heard the explosive bolts blow the pod door outward, and rolled onto foreign soil with my weapon raised, and my scanner active, and my training running on automatic like a second heartbeat. The air smelled wrong. I noticed it before anything else. Not toxic. Not chemically unusual. The filtration readout on my helmet confirmed the atmosphere was breathable, with mild supplementation, well within tolerance. But there was something underneath the standard readings, something my instruments could not categorize. A scent, like old stone, and deep water, and the metallic edge of a sky before a storm. I had dropped onto 30 worlds, and every one of them had smelled like something I could name. Earth smelled like something I could not. My squad fanned into formation around me. 14 soldiers, weapons hot, moving through the undergrowth, with the fluid precision of a unit that had operated together for years. Rin took position at my left shoulder, her scanner suite sweeping a 100-meter radius in overlapping arcs. Elvon anchored the rear, with his heavy plasma repeater braced against his hip. Sen moved near the center of the formation, his rifle steady, his breathing too fast but his feet placed with care. Overhead, the fleet confirmed air superiority. No human aircraft detected, no orbital defense platforms, no satellite-based weapon systems. The sky above Earth belonged to the Dominion, and the 12 simultaneous drop zones spread across the planet's surface were all reporting successful insertion. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. For approximately 9 minutes, Sergeant, Rin's voice came through the squad channel, low and careful. The forest is wrong. I stopped. The formation stopped with me, every soldier freezing in place with the discipline of training so deep it had become reflex. I listened. And in the act of listening, I understood what Ran meant, because there was nothing to hear. Not quiet. Not the muffled hush of a forest dampened by weather or distance. Silence. Absolute, complete, and total silence, as if every living thing in this forest had simultaneously held its breath. No birds, no insects, no rustling in the underbrush, no wind through the canopy. The trees stood motionless, their leaves hanging limp, and the air itself seemed to have stopped circulating, as if the atmosphere had forgotten that it was supposed to move. Bioscan, I ordered. Rin worked her instruments. The readout came back in 3 seconds, and when she reported it, her voice had changed. The professional calm was still there, but underneath it, I heard something I had never heard from her before, confusion that was beginning to curdle into fear. Life signs everywhere, Sergeant. Thousands, tens of thousands, The forest is saturated with biological signatures, but nothing is moving. Not a single organism within scanner range is exhibiting locomotion. They are all stationary, every single one. I looked at the trees, the undergrowth, the canopy above us, thick with leaves and branches, and the kind of dense vegetation that should have been alive with movement. Everything was still. It was as if the entire biome had been paused, frozen in a single frame, waiting for something. I gave the order to advance. We pushed forward through the forest for 20 minutes, moving toward our primary objective. A small human settlement at the base of the mountain range. Intelligence had projected minimal resistance. Militia forces, perhaps. Improvised weapons. The kind of scattered, desperate fighting that every conquered species attempted in the first hours of invasion before the reality of superior firepower broke their will. I expected to hear gunfire within the hour. I expected the forest to erupt with the chaos of a species fighting for its survival. Instead, we received a priority alert from Fleet Command. Drop Zone 4, located somewhere in the southern continent, had gone dark. Not under attack, not reporting casualties, simply gone. All 90 personnel had stopped transmitting simultaneously, and the fleet's overhead sensors showed their positions unchanged, their life signs still active, but their communications equipment producing nothing. No static, no interference, no distress signal, just silence. The same silence that surrounded my squad in this forest, spreading across the planet like a disease. Colonel Drass designated it an equipment malfunction and rerouted a secondary unit to investigate. His voice on the command channel carried the clipped confidence of an officer who had decided what the problem was and would not entertain alternatives. I recognized the tone. I had used it myself, many times, in situations where the truth was too uncomfortable to examine, and the mission required forward momentum regardless of what the truth might be. We reached the settlement at the 40-minute mark. It was a village. Small, maybe 200 structures, built from stone and wood and the kind of local materials that suggested a community more interested in living quietly than in impressing anyone. Roads of packed earth wound between the buildings. Gardens bordered the walls, thick with vegetation I did not recognize. There was a central square with a well and a gathering space, and the kind of communal architecture that spoke of a species that valued proximity to each other. There were no humans. Not hiding, not evacuated in an orderly fashion, leaving behind the telltale signs of organized retreat, packed vehicles, emptied shelves, stripped armories. No, the village was full. Tables held meals that were still warm. Doors stood open, as if someone had just walked through them. A cup sat on a windowsill, half full, steam still curling from its surface. In one building, I found a child's toy on the floor next to a chair that still held the impression of someone sitting in it. These people had been here moments ago. They had been living their ordinary lives, eating, drinking, sitting, playing, and then they had simply stopped being here, as if the village had exhaled and they had been the breath. But they had left something behind. Rin saw it first. She called me to the nearest building, and when I stepped through the door, I understood why her voice sounded the way it did. Every wall was covered in symbols, not painted with care or artistic intent, painted with urgency, with desperation, layer upon layer upon layer, symbols drawn over symbols, drawn over symbols, until the original surface was buried under a dense, overlapping tapestry of marks that covered every available space from floor to ceiling. I moved through the village and found the same thing everywhere. Every building, every door, every wall, every surface that could hold paint was buried under these symbols. I asked Rin to run them through the translation software. The software flagged them immediately. Wards. Protective sigils. The word the software used was one I had never encountered in a military context. Consecration. And they came from everywhere. 15 different human cultural traditions, at minimum, many of them centuries dead. Norse, Sumerian, Vedic, Slavic, Mesoamerican, Egyptian, Celtic. Symbols that no living human should have been using, drawn in combination patterns that no single human tradition had ever employed, all layered on top of each other, as if every protective prayer that humanity had ever spoken had been compressed into a single, desperate shout painted on the walls of a village in the mountains. Dorov's voice broke through on the command channel. He was aboard the Pale Verdict, monitoring the cultural analysis feed, and for the first time since the briefing, his flat, clinical tone had cracked. He was speaking too quickly, tripping over his words, and what he said made the hair on my neck stand straight. These symbols are not in current human use. Several of these traditions have been dead for 1,000 years. No living human culture combines them like this. This is not religion. This is not ritual. This is a species that remembered something it was supposed to have forgotten, and it is trying to call that something back. He requested permission from Colonel Drass to abort the cultural assessment. Drass denied the request. Dorov went silent, and I could hear in that silence the sound of a man who had just realized that the people above him were going to get the people below him killed. We found one of the sensor drones. It was sitting on the forest floor, 50 meters from the village perimeter, upright, intact, completely undamaged. These were the drones that had gone dark during our approach, the ones Drass had called a malfunction. This one looked as though someone had picked it up and carefully, gently, set it down on the ground the way you might place a sleeping child into a bed. Rin pulled the memory core. It was still functional. She accessed the last image the drone had recorded before it stopped transmitting, and she projected it onto her helmet display so I could see it. The image was taken from the drone's rear camera. It showed the drone from the outside, from below, as if photographed by someone standing on the ground looking up. But the drone had been at 30,000 meters when it went dark. The image should have been impossible. And in the image, visible against the pale curve of the upper atmosphere, was a shape, dark, massive, winged, two appendages that stretched outward from a central body so large that the drone looked like a grain of sand caught in the palm of a hand. The shape was carrying the drone downward, descending through the atmosphere, and the angle of its wings suggested not effort but leisure, as if transporting a piece of Dominion military technology from the edge of space to the surface of the planet was something it did without thinking about it. The shape had wings. I stared at the image. Rin stared at the image. Neither of us spoke, because there was nothing in our training, nothing in our experience, nothing in the entire military doctrine of the Dominion that provided a framework for what we were looking at. This was not a human aircraft. This was not a natural phenomenon. This was a living thing, a thing with wings, a thing large enough to hold a surveillance drone in one limb, and it had plucked our technology out of the upper atmosphere and laid it on the ground, the way you might remove an insect from your table. I ordered the squad into defensive positions. And then the comms began to scream. Drop Zone 7, Northern Africa. Their weapons had stopped functioning. Not jammed, not damaged. The energy cells were fully charged. The firing mechanisms were mechanically sound. Every diagnostic returned clean. But when the soldiers pulled the trigger, nothing happened. The plasma simply refused to discharge, as if the fundamental physics of energy transfer had been locally suspended within the boundaries of their operating zone. Drop Zone 11, Pacific Island Chain. The ocean was rising. Not a wave, not a tide. A wall of water forming a perfect vertical ring around the island, hundreds of meters tall, moving with impossible precision, and something was singing from beneath the surface. Not a signal, not a broadcast. A voice, deep and resonant and old, singing in a language that the translation software could not even classify, let alone translate. Drop Zone 2, Southeast Asia. Contact with an aquatic entity of indeterminate size. The entity was in the river. The entity was the river. The water itself had taken shape, forming a serpentine body so vast that it blocked their entire retreat corridor, and it dissolved and reformed around every weapon's discharge they sent into it, absorbing plasma bolts the way a lake absorbs raindrops. I stood in the village square, listening to the comms chatter from 12 drop zones dissolving into 12 different flavors of impossible, and I felt the crack in my certainty widen into a fracture, and the fracture widen into a gap, and through the gap I could see something I was not ready to see. The myths were looking back. Rin grabbed my arm. Her scanner was pulsing a proximity alert, and when she showed me the readout, her hand was shaking. Sergeant, the life signs I detected earlier, the ones that were stationary, they are no longer stationary. Where are they? Below us, deep underground, and they are rising. I heard it then, not through my ears. Through my boots, through the soles of my feet, pressed against the packed earth of a village that had been emptied by something I could not name. A vibration, low, rhythmic, rising through the ground like a heartbeat coming back to life. And from the forest around us, in every direction, from the darkness between the trees that my floodlights could not reach, I heard footsteps, hundreds of them, moving in unison, coming closer. Rin's scanner showed nothing. No thermal signatures, no biological readings, no electromagnetic emissions. According to every instrument we had, we were alone in this village, surrounded by empty forest, standing on solid ground. But the footsteps kept coming. And then, cutting through the static of collapsing drop zones and panicking soldiers, and a fleet that was beginning to understand it had made a terrible mistake, a transmission broke through on a frequency so old that our communication system almost rejected it. It was Dominion military encryption, standard format, standard protocol, but the codec it used had been decommissioned 300 years ago. The voice on the other end was screaming, and the scream was not human. It was one of ours. The transmission played through my helmet speakers in fractured bursts, corrupted by 3 centuries of signal decay, but still intelligible enough to understand. A female voice, Dominion military, speaking in the clipped cadence of a combat report, except that the cadence kept breaking apart, shattering against whatever she was trying to describe, because the language of military reporting had not been built to hold what she had witnessed. Her name was Haleth. Her rank was Strike Commander. She was from the 2nd Expedition, launched 312 years ago, and her voice was coming to me across the void between centuries, like a hand reaching out of a grave. I stood in the center of that empty village, my squad arrayed in a defensive ring around me, our weapons pointed at a forest that had begun to breathe, and I listened to a dead woman tell me what was coming. Engaged human forces in the valley at 1400 hours, Haleth's voice said, rough with static, shaking with something that went deeper than fear. Standard infantry resistance, primitive kinetics. We achieved fire superiority in the first 4 minutes. Human forces retreated to the eastern ridgeline. We pursued. At 1423 hours, the valley changed. She paused. I could hear her breathing. 300 years ago, in a valley on this same planet, she had paused to breathe before saying something that would rewrite everything she believed about the universe. The sky turned the color of old iron. The ground opened. Not an earthquake, not a seismic event. The ground chose to open, like a mouth, and figures rose from it. They were not human. They were shaped like humans, but they were too large, too bright. The light coming from them was not reflected. It was generated. They were made of it. I could not look at them directly, but I could not look away, because my eyes would not obey me. The transmission crackled. Haleth's voice dropped lower. They did not use weapons. One of them raised its hand and pointed at my artillery line. 16 guns, crews of 4 each, 64 soldiers. The figure pointed, and my artillery was no longer there, not destroyed, not disintegrated. There was no flash, no sound, no debris. The guns and the soldiers simply stopped existing, as if they had never been built, as if the space they had occupied had been politely asked to forget them, and the space had agreed. Rin was staring at me. Kovan had stopped watching the perimeter and turned to listen. Every soldier in my squad was frozen in place, weapons lowered, eyes wide, because this was not a ghost story told over drinks in a deployment bay. This was a Dominion military officer filing a combat report, and what she was describing was not combat. It was something that did not have a name. Haleth's recording continued for another 11 seconds, before it cut off. In those 11 seconds, she described the figure turning toward her position, and she began to say what its face looked like. And then, there was a sound that might have been a scream, or might have been static, and then there was nothing. I checked the signal origin. The transmission was not being relayed. It was being broadcast from a local source, somewhere on the surface of Earth, using equipment that should have stopped functioning 3 centuries ago. Someone had kept it running. Someone had wanted us to hear it. Colonel Drass came on the command channel. His voice had lost the clipped confidence of an hour ago. He sounded like a man standing on a ledge and trying to convince himself not to look down. All ground units, consolidate positions. Prepare for emergency extraction. Fleet will commence retrieval operations in 1 hour. 1 hour. I could work with 1 hour. 1 hour was a number. Numbers belonged to the world I understood, the world of tactics and timelines and measurable reality. I began issuing orders to my squad, directing them to tighten the perimeter, establish overlapping fields of fire, prepare the extraction beacon. Then the navigation officer aboard the Pale Verdict reported a problem, and the numbers stopped mattering. The fleet's orbital position had shifted, not drifted, which would have been normal, a minor correction, a routine thruster adjustment, shifted. The entire fleet had moved closer to the planet by 1,400 kilometers in the last 20 minutes, dragged inward by a gravitational pull that did not match any known model of Earth's mass. The navigation officer said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound technical and failing, that the planet appeared to have increased in mass by a factor of 6 since the invasion began. This was, he said, physically impossible. The planet could not have gained mass. Planets do not simply become heavier. And yet every instrument on every ship in the fleet was telling the same story, and the fleet was falling, slowly, inexorably, like a stone rolling toward the edge of a table. I did not have time to process this, because Sen said, "Sergeant, the tree line." I turned. Something was standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of our perimeter floodlights, partially obscured by the trunk of an ancient tree that looked small next to it. I raised my weapon sight and activated the magnification, and the image that filled my lens was the image that ended my old life and began my new one. It was humanoid, approximately 4 meters tall. It wore armor, or it was armor, or the distinction between the being and what covered it did not exist, because the surface of its body shifted and rippled with a light that came from within, a deep, liquid gold that pulsed in rhythm with the vibration I could still feel through the soles of my boots. The armor was covered in symbols, the same wards and sigils and consecrations that the humans had painted on every wall of this village, except these were not painted on. They were part of the surface. They grew from it, like script carved into the skin of a star. It was not moving. It was watching us. And the manner of its watching was the thing that broke something inside my chest, because it was not the watchfulness of a predator sizing up prey. It was not the vigilance of a sentry guarding a perimeter. It was the calm, patient, deeply familiar gaze of a parent standing in a doorway, watching strangers approach its children, and deciding how much patience it had left. "Fire," I said. Sen fired. The plasma bolt left his rifle at standard velocity, crossed the 60 meters between our position and the figure in a fraction of a second, struck the figure directly in the center of its chest, and stopped. Not deflected, not absorbed, not dispersed. The bolt hung in the air in front of the figure's body, suspended, motionless, glowing with its own trapped energy, like an insect caught in amber. It hung there for 2 seconds. Then it went dark. The energy simply ceased, as if someone had asked it politely to stop being energy, and it had complied. The figure tilted its head. That gesture, that small, quiet, unmistakably human gesture, the slight sideways inclination of a head, expressing curiosity or mild amusement, performed by a 4-meter-tall being, made of living light and ancient scripture, standing in a forest that had gone silent for its arrival. That gesture made my blood go cold in a way that no weapon, no threat, no enemy in 19 years of war had ever managed, because the gesture meant that this thing understood us. It was not a force of nature, it was not a mindless phenomenon, it was intelligent, and it was curious, and it was looking at us the way I might look at a particularly bold insect that had landed on my dinner plate. Then it was gone. Not retreating, not fading, gone. One frame it was there, and the next frame the space between the trees was empty, and the forest was silent again, and my squad was standing in a ring of light, in a dead village, on a planet that was pulling our fleet out of the sky. The comms erupted. Every surviving drop zone reported simultaneously, and what they reported was a catalog of nightmares dressed in the language of military observation. Drop Zone 9, Northern Europe. Humanoid figures descending from the Aurora Borealis. They were made of light, and they carried weapons that crackled with atmospheric discharge, and they walked across the sky as if the air beneath their feet was solid ground, and every step they took left a burning imprint in the clouds that lingered for minutes after they passed. Drop Zone 6, Central Asia. A single human had walked into their perimeter, unarmed, unhurried. A man of average height and average build, wearing simple clothing, showing no signs of distress or urgency. He had sat down on the ground in front of their commanding officer, and he had spoken in fluent, unaccented Dominion Standard, a language that no human should have known existed, and he had said 6 words. "You were warned. The symbols are not metaphors." Then he had stood up and walked back into the darkness, and no one had stopped him, because every soldier in that drop zone had been unable to move, not paralyzed, not physically restrained, simply unable, as if their muscles had received a suggestion to remain still, and had found the suggestion more compelling than any order their brains could issue. I was recalibrating. Every soldier recalibrates in combat. The plan fails, the situation changes, the enemy does something unexpected, and you adjust. You find the new framework. You locate the updated set of rules, and you operate within them, and you survive. That is what training is for. That is what experience provides. But there was no framework for this. There were no rules. The enemy, if you could even call them that, was not operating within any system of warfare I had ever studied. They were not trying to destroy us. Destruction requires effort, implies opposition, suggests a contest between forces. What was happening on Earth was not a contest. It was a correction. Something vast and old and infinitely patient was rearranging the situation back to the way it wanted things to be, and our invasion force was not an enemy to be defeated, but a minor disruption to be tidied away. I received a priority ping from the fleet. My blood was already cold, but the message made it colder. A Dominion deep space rescue beacon had been detected on the surface of Earth. Standard emergency protocol, standard frequency, broadcasting on a continuous loop. But the beacon was not from the 4th expedition. The signature was old. Very old. It matched the equipment specifications of the 1st expedition, launched 512 years ago. Someone from that expedition was still alive, still broadcasting, still waiting for rescue after 5 centuries on a planet that the Dominion had failed to conquer 3 times. And the beacon was broadcasting from directly beneath my position, deep underground, below the village, below the mountain. Something was down there, sealed in the earth beneath my boots, and it had been calling for help since before my grandparents' were born. I looked at Rin. She had already located the signal source on her scanner, and her face held the expression of someone who has just realized that the ground they are standing on is not ground at all, but the lid of something that has been closed for a very long time. "There is a fissure," she said. "Natural formation, 60 meters south of the village center. It descends approximately 1 kilometer. The beacon signal originates from the bottom. 1 kilometer down, into the earth of a planet that was reshaping itself around us, into the darkness beneath a village covered in prayers." I made the decision in 3 seconds. Kovan, Rin, and Sen would come with me. The remaining 10 soldiers would hold the surface perimeter under the command of Lance Corporal Drath. We would descend, locate the beacon, assess the situation, and return. 40 minutes. 1 hour at most. Drath looked at me with the eyes of a soldier who understood that the plan was insane, and the alternatives were worse. I held his gaze. He nodded. We entered the fissure. The descent was steep but navigable, a natural crack in the mountain's foundation that wound downward through layers of rock that my geological scanner dated as impossibly old. Not old by the standards of a young planet, old by the standards of the galaxy. The mineral composition of the stone around us predated the formation of Earth's solar system by billions of years, as if the mountain had been built from material that existed before the planet did, placed here with intention by something that operated on timescales I could not comprehend. The walls were carved, not by human hands, not by any tool I recognized. The carvings were too precise, too deep, too uniform, etched into the stone with a method that left no tool marks, no scoring, no evidence of physical contact. The symbols were similar to the ones in the village, but older, deeper, more complex, and as I descended past them, my suit's translation software crashed. It tried 9 times to process the language. On the 9th attempt, it produced a single partial translation, before failing permanently. Here sleep those who were before the naming of stars. The words hung on my helmet display for 3 seconds before the system went dark. I read them twice. I understood each word individually. Together, they formed a sentence that my mind could parse but could not hold, because the implications of that sentence reached backward through time, to a point before time had learned how to flow, and forward through consequence to a future I was not equipped to imagine. We kept descending. The fissure widened as we went deeper, the walls pulling apart to form a corridor, then a passage, then a tunnel that curved and branched with the organic irregularity of a living system, like the interior of a massive organism, veins and chambers and pathways that pulsed with a faint luminescence that came from the stone itself. The air grew warmer, the vibration grew stronger, and the silence changed. On the surface, the silence had been an absence, a void where sound should have been. Down here, the silence was a presence. It had weight, it had texture. It pressed against my ears with the gentle insistence of something listening. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a chamber. I have seen large spaces. I have stood in the hangar bays of dreadnoughts and the assembly halls of conquered capitals, and the vast, echoing ruins of civilizations that died before my species learned to walk. This chamber was different. Not larger, although it was large. Different in the way it made me feel, which was small. Not physically small, but existentially small, as if the space had been designed to remind whoever entered it that they were a single note in a symphony that had been playing since before the concept of music existed. The survival pod sat in the center of the chamber. Standard Dominion military issue, 500 years old, covered in a fine layer of dust that had settled over centuries of absolute stillness. Its status lights were active, its power cell was humming. The occupant display read, "One living being, biosyn stable, held in deep medical stasis." Rin ran a diagnostic on the pod's power system and looked at me with an expression I will never forget. "The fuel cell should have depleted 430 years ago, Sergeant. It has not depleted. Its current output is 11% higher than its original factory specification. Something is feeding it energy, something external, something I cannot detect." I approached the pod. Through the narrow viewing port in its upper surface, I could see a face. A Dominion face. Species Valk, same as me. Female, emaciated, scarred, aged in ways that stasis should have prevented, but clearly had not entirely managed. She was missing her left arm below the elbow, and the wound had been sealed not by Dominion medical technology, but by something else. A smooth, luminous scar tissue that glowed faintly with the same golden light I had seen on the figure in the forest. Her ID tag was visible through the port. Lieutenant Nessic Adra, 1st Expeditionary Corps. She had been down here for 512 years. I opened the pod. The revival process took 4 minutes. The stasis field disengaged in stages, warming her core temperature, restarting her circulatory system, re-engaging her neural pathways with the careful, methodical sequence that Dominion medical technology used to pull a body back from the edge of suspended death. Her eyelids flickered, her breathing shifted from the shallow, mechanical rhythm of stasis to the deeper, ragged pattern of consciousness returning. She opened her eyes. For a moment, she looked at nothing. Her pupils were dilated, unfocused, lost in the transition between the dreamless void of stasis and the sudden overwhelming reality of waking up. Then her eyes found my face, and her gaze sharpened, and she looked at my uniform, my rank insignia, the Dominion crest on my chest plate, and the expression that crossed her face was not relief. It was horror. She began to scream, not in pain, in recognition, in the desperate, broken recognition of someone who has seen this before, who knows exactly what it means, and who understands that the cycle she had prayed would end has begun again. No. Her voice was a ruin, cracked by 5 centuries of silence, barely louder than a whisper, but the word filled the chamber. "No, no, no. You came back. They told me you would come back. They told me you would never stop coming back." Rin tried to stabilize her. Nessic shoved her away with her remaining arm, her eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made me take a step backward. "Who told you?" I asked. She looked at the walls of the chamber. "At the carvings. at the symbols that predated the naming of stars. She did not answer the question. I told her we were the fourth expedition. I told her the Dominion had sent us to subjugate Earth. Her reaction was a laugh, a sound so devoid of humor that it barely qualified as laughter. A dry, airless expulsion of breath that carried the weight of 500 years of solitary knowledge. "How many drop zones have gone silent?" she asked. I hesitated. 7. She nodded, as if confirming a calculation she had already completed. It was faster this time. We lasted 4 days. The second lasted 2. You will not last the night. I knelt beside the pod, bringing my face level with hers. "Lieutenant Adra, what happened to the first expedition?" She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes were old. Not the kind of old that age produces, the gradual dimming, the accumulation of weariness. Her eyes were the kind of old that witnessing something produces, the permanent alteration of a mind that has seen something it was never designed to see. She spoke in short, disconnected sentences, as if the memories were physical objects lodged in her throat, and she had to force them out one at a time. "We landed in force, 3,000 soldiers, full armored division. Air support. Orbital overwatch. We engaged the human military, and we won. It was not difficult, they fought well, but their technology was inferior. We established fire superiority in the first 30 minutes, and had functional control of our designated zones within 2 days. By the 4th day, we had begun occupation protocols. Standard procedure, disarmament, communication control, administrative restructuring. Everything was proceeding normally." She paused. The golden glow from the scar on her arm pulsed once, slowly, like a heartbeat. On the 7th day, the humans stopped fighting. All of them. Not a phased surrender, not a negotiated ceasefire. Every human on the planet, simultaneously, put down whatever they were holding, walked out of whatever structure they were in, and knelt. Billions of them, in the streets, in the fields, on the shores, on the mountains. They knelt, and they bowed their heads, and they spoke in unison. Spoke what? A language. A single language. Not any of the thousands of languages they normally use. One language, spoken by every mouth on the planet at the same time, and it was a language older than anything our linguists had ever recorded. Older than their civilization. Older than their species. The words did not register on our translation systems. They did not register on our audio equipment. The sound existed on a frequency that our instruments were not designed to detect, and yet we heard it. Every soldier on the planet heard it. Not with our ears, with something deeper, something in the structure of our cells that recognized the sound, even though our conscious minds did not. She gripped the edge of the pod with her remaining hand. Her knuckles turned white. And then the sky answered. I waited. Rin had stopped trying to administer medical aid and was standing motionless, her instruments forgotten, her eyes fixed on Nessik's face. Kovan had his weapon lowered and his mouth open. Sen looked like a child being told that the darkness under his bed had always been real. "What answered?" I asked. Nessik looked at me with the terrible clarity of a witness delivering testimony she knows will not be believed, but must be delivered regardless. Everything the humans had ever believed in. Everything they had ever prayed to. Everything they had ever drawn on cave walls and carved into temple stone and written into books and whispered to their children in the dark. All of it, all at once. She described what came. She did not use military terminology. She could not. The vocabulary of combat had been built by beings who fought other beings, and what Nessik described was not a fight. A figure standing on the horizon, tall enough to block the sun, robed in light so bright that looking at it through tactical filters still left afterimages burned into the back of her skull for days. A sound like thunder, except the thunder was a voice, and the voice was saying something, and the something was not words but meaning itself, raw and unfiltered, poured directly into the consciousness of every living thing within range. Hands rising from the ocean, each finger the size of a cruiser, the water cascading from joints the size of mountains, as something beneath the surface lifted itself partially into the air, and then settled back, not emerging, not attacking, simply reminding the universe that it was there. Light pouring from the ground itself, from the soil, from the stone, from the roots of trees and the beds of rivers. as if the planet's core had opened its eyes and was looking up through the skin of the Earth at the invaders standing on its surface. "We fired everything," Nessic said. Her voice had dropped to a whisper. "Energy weapons, kinetic bombardment, orbital strikes. We fired every weapon we had at every target we could identify. And the weapons worked. The bolts flew, the missiles launched, the orbital beams descended, and they reached the figures, and they touched the figures, and they did nothing. They were not deflected. They were not absorbed. They simply did not matter. They existed in a category of reality that the figures were not subject to, like throwing sand at a mountain and expecting the mountain to flinch." She looked at me. Her eyes were dry. Beyond tears, beyond the kind of emotion that produces them. 3,000 soldiers. 16 hours. At the end, there were 9 of us. The chamber was silent. The vibration in the ground had not stopped. If anything, it had grown stronger. A low, persistent pulse that I could feel in my teeth. "Your briefings showed you their myths," Nessic said. "Their dragons, their gods, their spirits. Their warriors and their monsters and their kings of the underworld. Your soldiers laughed." She reached out and gripped my arm. Her fingers closed around my wrist with a strength that 5 centuries of stasis should have made impossible, and she pulled me close, and she whispered 2 words. "They are real." The words entered my ears and traveled through my body and settled in the center of my chest, like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward, and everywhere they touched, a certainty I had carried for my entire adult life quietly dissolved. The certainty that the universe was mechanical, that physics was the final word, that anything large enough to understand was small enough to control. That certainty dissolved, and what replaced it was not fear, not yet, but a vast, vertiginous openness, like stepping through a door I had always assumed was a wall, and discovering that the room I had lived in my entire life was a closet inside a cathedral. "Why are you alive?" I asked. "Why did they spare you?" Nessic released my arm. She leaned back against the pod, and her expression shifted from the intensity of testimony to the exhaustion of someone who has carried a truth too heavy for one person for far too long. "They put me in this pod. Not the Dominion. Them. The beings. They sealed me inside, healed my wounds with something I cannot explain, and placed me in this chamber. I did not understand why at first. I thought it was mercy, or curiosity, or some form of imprisonment that I was too limited to recognize." She shook her head. "It was none of those things. I am a message. Every expedition that reaches Earth will find survivors from the previous one, kept alive, kept waiting, kept as living records of what happens when the Dominion does not listen. The beings do not want to destroy us. Destruction is beneath them. They want us to understand. And they know that records can be sealed, and files can be classified, and institutional memory can be erased. But a living voice, a living pair of eyes that has seen what cannot be unseen, that is harder to dismiss." She fixed me with a stare that carried 500 years of solitary knowledge. "You are the 4th expedition. You found me. I have delivered my message. In 100 or 200 or 500 years, the 5th will come, and they will find you." Above us, the comms erupted. Rin's scanner lit up with a cascade of alerts, and through the layers of stone between us and the surface, I could hear the faint, distorted sound of Drath's voice, shouting a contact report. The armored figure was back. The one I had seen in the tree line. The one that had swallowed a plasma bolt and tilted its head like a curious parent. It had returned, and it was not alone. There were hundreds of them, standing in a perfect circle around the village, and they were kneeling, not in submission. Their posture was not the posture of surrender. Their heads were bowed, their arms were spread, and the golden light from their bodies was pulsing in perfect synchronization, growing brighter with each pulse, and the ground beneath the village was vibrating in resonance with that light, as if the earth itself was responding to a frequency that the beings were generating. Nessic closed her eyes. "They are praying," she said, "just like before." She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling of the chamber, as if she could see through a kilometer of stone to the sky above. "It is starting." The vibration built. Not a sound, not a tremor. A frequency that I felt in my bones, in the spaces between my cells, in some deep and ancient part of my biology that predated conscious thought, a part of me that recognized what was happening, even though the rest of me did not. Rin's instruments detected an energy reading from the surface that exceeded the output of the entire Dominion fleet. Something that had been sleeping beneath this village, beneath this mountain, beneath this planet, since before the naming of stars. And it was not happy. I have been a soldier for 19 years. In those years, I have faced plasma fire and kinetic bombardment, and the desperate fury of cornered species fighting for their survival. I have developed a vocabulary for fear so precise that I can name 37 distinct variations, the way a painter names shades of blue. The cold fear of ambush, the hot fear of close-quarters combat, the numb fear of attrition, the slow grinding down of bodies and will, the sharp fear of a friend dying beside you. What I felt rising through the stone floor of that underground chamber was none of those. This was a category of fear that existed beyond my vocabulary, beyond my experience, beyond the conceptual framework of any military training ever devised. This was the fear of standing at the base of something so vast that your mind cannot construct a boundary for it, cannot find an edge, cannot locate the point where the thing ends and ordinary reality resumes. "Move," I said. "Surface. Now." We ran. Nessic could barely stand, but Kovan lifted her onto his shoulders without being asked, and began the ascent at a pace that should have been impossible, given her weight and the steepness of the passage. Rin led the way, her scanner useless now, every instrument overloaded by the energy readings pouring upward through the rock. Sen brought up the rear, and I could hear his breathing, fast and ragged, the sound of a young soldier whose training was the only thing standing between him and complete collapse. The carvings on the tunnel walls were glowing. The symbols that predated the naming of stars were no longer inert etchings in stone. They burned with a light that was neither warm nor cold, a light that existed on a spectrum my eyes were not built to perceive, and yet I could see it, could feel it pushing against my retinas like a word, trying to be spoken through the wrong kind of mouth. As we climbed, the light brightened, and the vibration intensified, and the air itself grew thick with a pressure that was not atmospheric but intentional, as if the space around us was being compressed by the focused attention of something enormous. We reached the surface in 11 minutes. The sky had changed. I emerged from the fissure into a world that no longer matched the one I had descended from. The darkness was gone. The night sky, the stars, the familiar void that separates worlds from worlds, all of it had been replaced by something else. A luminous, bruised gold, the color of a sun seen through deep water, spread from horizon to horizon, and it was not the light of any star. It had no source. It came from everywhere, from the air itself, from the ground, from the spaces between atoms, as if someone had taken the concept of light and poured it directly into the fabric of reality, without bothering to filter it through a physical origin. The stars were still visible, but they were wrong, rearranged, shifted from their established positions into new patterns that matched the symbols on the cavern walls, as if the sky itself had been rewritten, its contents reorganized into a language written before the galaxy had finished forming. I stared upward and felt something I can only describe as grammatical vertigo. The dizzying sense that I was looking at a sentence I could almost read, written in a language I almost knew, and that if I understood it fully, the understanding would not fit inside my mind.
Droth met me at the perimeter. His face told me everything before his words did.
10 soldiers remained on the surface, all alive, all unharmed, all staring at the tree line with the glazed, uncomprehending expressions of people who have seen something that has overwritten their basic assumptions about reality and left nothing in their place. "The figures," Drath said. His voice was flat, emptied. "They knelt for 9 minutes. Then they stood. Then more came. Sergeant, there are hundreds of them. They formed a circle around the village. Perfect geometry. And they are walking toward us. Not charging. Walking." I looked past him, and I saw them. They came from every direction, emerging from the tree line in a procession that had the solemn, unhurried cadence of a ritual observed for longer than any civilization had existed. Each figure was approximately 4 meters tall, armored in the same shifting luminous material I had seen before, covered in the same ancient symbols, radiating the same golden light. They walked in step, their footfalls synchronized, and each step made the ground hum with a resonance that I felt in my joints and my spine, and the hollow spaces behind my eyes. My soldiers were firing. The weapons worked. This was, in a way, the most terrifying detail of all. The figures were allowing the weapons to work. The plasma bolts left the rifles, crossed the distance, struck the figures, and passed through them like light through glass. Not deflected, not absorbed. Passed through, because the figures were not entirely here. They existed on a plane of reality that intersected with physical space only as much as they chose. And they had chosen to intersect just enough to be visible, just enough to be present, just enough to be understood, but not enough to be harmed. They were not invulnerable. That word implies a contest, a force meeting a resistance. There was no contest. The concept of harming them belonged to a category of reality that simply did not apply to what they were. Firing at them was not futile, the way firing at a shield is futile. It was futile the way shouting at gravity is futile. They operated on a different level of existence, and our weapons existed several floors below. I ordered my soldiers to cease fire. Some of them did not comply, not out of insubordination, but out of the kind of desperate, automatic reflex that seizes a drowning person, the mindless need to do something, even when doing something is meaningless. I shouted the order again, and this time they stopped, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Colonel Drass attempted orbital bombardment. I saw it happen. From the surface, looking up through the golden sky, I watched the beams descend from the fleet. Bright columns of energy that represented the combined destructive output of 12 capital ships. Enough firepower to sterilize a continent. The beams fell through the atmosphere like javelins thrown by gods of our own lesser making. They reached approximately 200 meters above the ground. And then they curved. Not scattered, not dispersed. Curved, bending in smooth, graceful arcs, redirected by an invisible geometry that treated the laws of physics as suggestions rather than rules. The beams bent upward, accelerating as they climbed, gaining velocity, gaining precision, and they struck the fleet. The Dominion's own weapons, fired from its own ships, redirected by a force that did not bother to generate its own destructive energy, because it found ours sufficient, struck the pale verdict across its port bow. Drass went silent. The command channel went silent. The fleet, the 12 capital ships that had entered the Sol system with absolute confidence and overwhelming firepower, went silent, and the silence from orbit was the mirror image of the silence in the forest. And I understood that the two silences were the same silence, and they always had been. From the east, something larger approached. I cannot describe it in visual terms, and I have spent a long time trying. My eyes did not refuse to function. My optic nerves did not overload. What happened was more precise and more disturbing. My visual processing system encountered a signal that it had never been designed to carry, a set of information that exceeded its bandwidth so completely that it did not even register as visual data. It was as if someone had tried to display a symphony through a single pixel. The information was there. My senses simply did not possess the resolution to render it. I perceived it in other ways, as heat, a warmth that was not thermal but emotional, a radiance that I felt in my memory rather than on my skin, as sound, a low, resonant chord that contained harmonics I could feel in my circulatory system, in the rhythm of my blood, as pressure, an impossible density of presence that made the air feel thick and the ground feel thin, and the boundary between matter and meaning feel like a suggestion. It had a shape, vaguely humanoid, immeasurably tall. The golden light that suffused the sky intensified around it, until looking in its direction was like looking at the core of a star through closed eyelids. And even that comparison is insufficient, because stars are physical objects obeying physical laws, and this thing was not physical and did not obey. The shape was a concession. I understood this without being told, in the same way that I understood the carved language in the tunnel without being able to read it. The being was showing me a simplified version of itself, a projection, a kindness. The way you might draw a stick figure to represent a person, to a child who has never seen one. If this being showed its actual form, if it peeled back the concession and revealed what it truly was, my consciousness would not survive the revelation. Not because the revelation would be violent, because it would be too large. My mind would try to contain it, the way a cup tries to contain an ocean, and the cup would simply cease to be a cup. It stopped at the edge of the village. The figures in the procession had arranged themselves in concentric rings around it, kneeling once more, their heads bowed, their golden light dimming in the presence of something that made their radiance look like candlelight next to a sun. It did not speak. Speaking implies the use of sound waves, the vibration of air, the mechanical process of producing language through a physical medium. What this being did was something else. It communicated on a frequency that bypassed my ears entirely and arrived in the part of my consciousness that existed before language, before thought, before the electrochemical processes that produce what I call my mind. It placed its meaning directly into the structure of my awareness, the way you might place a stone on a table, and the meaning was this. We made them. They carry our fire. You may not have them. 8 words. No anger. No threat. No ultimatum delivered with the implicit promise of consequences. A statement of fact, communicated with the casual finality of a parent, telling a stranger that the children in the yard are not available for adoption. The simplicity of it was what undid me. This being, this entity that existed on a scale that made galaxies look like furniture, had not bothered with grandeur or intimidation, or any of the theatrical displays of power that lesser beings use to establish dominance. It had simply stated what was true, and the truth was so absolute that arguing with it would have been like arguing with the speed of light. We made them, humanity, this small, loud, fragile, stubborn, impossible species that had not even mastered fusion power. Something had set them on this little blue world, and watched over them, and guarded them, and loved them with a ferocity that spanned geological epochs, and the dragons and the gods and the spirits and the warriors and the monsters that humanity had encoded in its oldest stories were not metaphors, they were not archetypes, they were not the fumbling attempts of primitive minds to explain thunder and disease and death. They were memories, racial memories, burned so deep into the human psyche that 10,000 years of rationality and science and technological progress had not managed to erase them, because some things are too true to be forgotten, and the beings that had made humanity were the truest things in the universe. The being raised one hand. Every Dominion weapon on the planet and in orbit powered down, simultaneously. Every rifle, every sidearm, every cannon, every turret, every missile bay, every energy cell on every ship in the fleet. Not destroyed, not damaged. Switched off, with the gentle, firm decisiveness of a parent, removing a sharp object from a toddler's grip. I dropped my weapon, not because I was ordered to, not because I was afraid, although I was afraid, more afraid than I had ever been, or would ever be again. I dropped it because holding it felt absurd. Because pointing a plasma rifle at the sky while standing in the presence of something that had created a species and guarded it for longer than the Dominion had existed was so fundamentally ridiculous that my hands could not maintain the pretense. Around me, my soldiers dropped their weapons too, one by one, with the slow, dazed movements of sleepwalkers emerging from a dream. They let their rifles fall to the ground. Sen sat down, simply sat down on the earth, his legs folding beneath him, and he looked up at the sky with an expression that was not fear or awe, but something quieter, something that might have been acceptance. The evacuation was not violent. The beings did not destroy the fourth expedition. They returned it. Drop pods across the planet resealed themselves, their hatches closing with the pneumatic hiss of automated systems that should not have been able to activate without manual input. The pods launched, climbing through the golden sky on trajectories so precise that they required no course correction, delivered to the carrier's docking bays with an accuracy that exceeded our own navigation technology by orders of magnitude. Soldiers found themselves standing in their deployment bays with no memory of the transit. One moment they were on the surface of Earth, surrounded by beings that defied comprehension. The next moment, they were aboard the Pale Verdict, blinking in fluorescent light, their weapons gone, their armor intact, their bodies unharmed, as if they had been picked up and placed back on the shelf by a hand so gentle that they had not felt the motion. The fleet's navigation systems unlocked. A course was plotted, not by any Dominion officer, not by any algorithm in the fleet's computer banks, but by the navigation system itself, acting on instructions that no one had entered. The course led away from Sol, away from Earth, away from the small blue world, where something ancient and vast and loving stood guard over its children. The navigation computer displayed a single text output in perfect, unaccented Dominion standard. "This is your last warning. There will not be a fifth." I stood in the briefing room, the same briefing room where I had laughed 12 hours ago. The seats were empty. The tactical display was dark. The air still smelled faintly of the ration drinks that 200 soldiers had consumed while watching images of dragons and gods and laughing at the idea that any of it could be real. Nessic stood beside me, 500 years old, one arm, scars that glowed with golden light. She looked at the empty room, and she looked at me, and she said nothing. She did not need to. The fleet withdrew from the Sol system at maximum speed, and no one spoke during the transit. Not a word. 200 soldiers sat in their quarters, and they stared at walls, and they breathed, and they processed what had happened to them, and the processing would take the rest of their lives, and it would never be complete. I am recording this account 3 days later, in the Dominion's Central Military Archive, by direct order of the Founders. The Founders knew. I learned this during my debriefing, which was conducted not by military intelligence, not by Fleet Command, not by any of the institutional bodies that normally handle post-mission analysis, but by the Founders themselves, 2 of them, in a chamber so deep within the Dominion's administrative core that I did not know it existed. They sat across from me, ancient beyond any useful measure of age, and they listened to my report with the patient, unsurprised expressions of beings who have heard this story before. Because they have heard it before. 3 times before. From 3 different witnesses, each one recovered from a survival pod on the surface of Earth, each one carrying the same message, each one wearing the same expression of shattered certainty that I now wear like a second skin. The Founders have always known what lives on Earth. They have always known what guards humanity. They knew before the first expedition launched, and they let it launch anyway. They knew before the second, and the third, and the fourth, and they let each one go. And they sealed the records afterward, and they waited for the next generation of military leadership to grow confident enough to propose a 5th attempt. I asked them why. Why send soldiers to die against something you know cannot be defeated? Why seal the records instead of broadcasting the truth? Why allow the cycle to repeat? The elder of the 2 Founders looked at me with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall the way I have seen seasons change, and she said something I will carry in my chest until the day my body fails. "Because we are a conquering species, Sergeant Ton. Conquest is in our marrow. If we told every generation the truth about Earth, they would believe us for a time, a century, perhaps 2, and then a new generation would arise that had not seen the truth with its own eyes, and they would read the records and call them exaggeration, and they would propose a new expedition, and the cycle would resume regardless. The only warning that survives is a living one, a voice, a face, a pair of eyes that carries the weight of what it has seen. Files can be dismissed, witnesses cannot." She was right. I know she was right because I spent 19 years dismissing files. I spent 19 years reading mission reports and tactical analyses and cultural assessments and treating every word as data to be processed and filed and forgotten. If someone had shown me a file that said Earth was guarded by beings older than the galaxy, I would have called it mythology. I would have called it superstition. I would have laughed. I am not laughing now. This recording will be sealed. I know this. It will be placed in the same archive as the testimonies of the 3 witnesses who came before me, and a classification level will be applied, and the door will close, and the archive will wait in the darkness for the next generation of Dominion leadership to grow bold enough to try again. And they will try. The Founders know this. I know this. The beings on Earth know this, which is why they do not destroy us entirely, which is why they leave survivors, which is why they place us in pods and keep us alive for centuries and set up rescue beacons so that the next wave of invaders will find us exactly as they found me. Because the beings understand something about conquest-driven civilizations that the civilizations themselves refuse to accept. That the lesson must be taught again and again and again, to every generation, forever. Because arrogance is a renewable resource, and humility has a half-life. So I am speaking to you. You, the commander of the 5th expedition. You, the officer who found this recording in the archive, who pulled it out, who listened to it with the same skepticism I would have felt, who is right now sitting in a briefing room somewhere, deciding that the old veterans were exaggerating, that the sealed records are the product of institutional cowardice, that this time will be different, that your weapons are better, that your strategy is sharper, that you will succeed where 4 expeditions failed. You will sit in a briefing room, you will see their myths, you will see the dragons, and the gods, and the undead armies, and the world serpents, and the sky beings. You will laugh. I know this because I laughed, because Nessic laughed, because Haleth laughed, because every soldier in every expedition laughed. Laughing is what we do when we encounter something too large for our understanding. We make it small with mockery, and then we go to meet it, and then we learn that some things do not become small just because we laugh at them. You will go to Earth. Your weapons will work until they choose to let them stop working. Your fleet will orbit until they choose to pull it closer. Your soldiers will walk on the surface until the surface decides to show them what lives beneath it. And then the sky will change color, and the stars will rearrange themselves, and figures will emerge from the forests and the mountains and the oceans and the light itself, and you will fire everything you have, and it will not matter. And in the silence after your last bolt fades, you will hear the same 8 words I heard. We made them, they carry our fire. You may not have them. And you will understand. In that moment, standing on the soil of a small blue world orbiting a minor star, in an unremarkable arm of an ordinary galaxy, you will understand that humanity was never the danger. Humanity is the smallest part of what lives on Earth. They are the children. They are the protected. They are the beloved. The danger is what loves them. And it does not sleep. It does not forget. It does not age. It does not diminish. It was there before the first star ignited, and it will be there after the last star dies, and it has watched over its creation with a patience and a ferocity that makes our entire civilization look like a candle flame in a hurricane. You will go anyway. I know you will. The founders know you will. The beings on Earth know you will. And when you do, and when you stand where I stood, and when you feel what I felt, and when your certainty cracks, and your arrogance drains away, and you are left holding nothing but the small, cold truth that the universe is older, and stranger, and more magnificent than you ever imagined, you will think of this recording. You will think of my voice, and you will wish, as I wish now, that you had listened. But you will not have listened, and the cycle will continue. And somewhere in the darkness of the Dominion archive, a new recording will join the others, and a new voice will speak the same warning, and a new pair of eyes will carry the same weight, and the weight will grow heavier with each generation, and it will never be heavy enough to stop us from trying again. That is the tragedy of conquest. Not that we fail, that we never learn. I am Sergeant Vikel Ton, 9th Expeditionary Corps, 4th Expedition to Earth. I have seen what guards that world. I have heard it speak. I have felt the weight of its attention settle on me like the gaze of something so far beyond my comprehension that even calling it incomprehensible is a form of flattery, because incomprehensibility implies a boundary, and this thing has none. The humans call them myths. The founders call them a designation. Nessic calls them by no name at all, because 500 years of solitude have taught her that naming them is an act of arrogance so profound it borders on comedy. I call them real. And if you go to Earth, so will you.